March 1943. The Oslo rail yard at 2 in the morning. 22-year-old Anne-Sofie Østvedt crouched behind a stack of lumber crates, her breath fogging in the cold air, listening to the footsteps of 2 Wehrmacht sentries pass within 3 meters of her position. In her coat pocket, a folded map marking the arrival schedule for a Nazi ammunition train. In her mind, the coordinates for a weapons drop that would reach 17 Milorg cells by dawn. She pressed her fingers against the rough wood, felt the splinters bite into skin still stained faintly gray from the chemicals she had handled earlier that day in the university lab. The sentries moved on. She waited 30 seconds, then slipped back into the shadows, carrying intelligence that would redirect an entire resistance network. No one at the rail yard knew her real name. No one in Milorg knew she was a woman. To them she was only Aslak, a commander whose orders arrived by courier, whose strategies unfolded with mechanical precision, whose identity remained a carefully guarded void. Anne-Sofie Østvedt was one of the highest-ranking operatives in Norway's underground resistance during World War II, yet her story barely registers in the historical record. She joined Milorg, the primary Norwegian resistance organization, in 1941, when she was just 20 years old. By 1943, she had risen to become second in command of the Intelligence and Coordination Branch, a role that required managing weapons shipments, relaying coded intelligence to Allied forces, and overseeing sabotage operations across occupied Norway. She did all of this under the codename Aslak, a traditionally male name that allowed her to operate with an authority that gender prejudice would have otherwise denied. For nearly the entire war, even her fellow resistance fighters believed Aslak was a man. This quiet deception became her greatest operational advantage. The Nazis were hunting a male commander. Her own network assumed their second-in-command was someone older, harder, more conventionally militant. Anne-Sofie moved through both worlds, student by day, shadow strategist by night, and the mismatch between expectation and reality kept her alive. She was born in Oslo in 1921, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a pharmacist. Her childhood was marked by books, science, and a stubborn refusal to accept limitations. By the time she entered the University of Oslo to study chemistry in 1939, she had already developed a reputation among her peers for being precise, relentless, and difficult to intimidate. Then, on April 9, 1940, German forces invaded Norway. Anne-Sofie watched her city change. She felt the weight of silence settle over her country like frost. But by the winter of 1941, staying silent had become unbearable. Her entry into resistance work came through a chance meeting at the university. A fellow student mentioned he was looking for couriers to carry messages between Oslo and rural cells. The work was dangerous, imprisonment or execution if caught. Anne-Sofie volunteered immediately. Within a week she was moving through checkpoints with fabricated stories about visiting relatives. She was underestimated so consistently that she learned to weaponize it. By early 1942, Anne-Sofie had moved beyond courier work and into operational planning. Milorg was expanding rapidly, but it was also fractured, disorganized, and vulnerable to infiltration. The leadership needed someone who could manage logistics, coordinate drops, and relay intelligence without drawing attention. Anne-Sofie's chemistry background gave her a natural aptitude for precision and problem-solving, and her willingness to take risks gave her credibility. When she was offered the position of second-in-command for the Oslo-based intelligence branch, she accepted on one condition: she would operate under a male codename. The leadership agreed. From that point forward, Anne-Sofie Østvedt ceased to exist in resistance records. Only Aslak remained. The double identity was not a disguise. Anne-Sofie never altered her appearance. She simply allowed people to assume. Orders from Aslak arrived in written form. Terse, tactical, impersonal. Operatives imagined a hardened veteran, never suspecting a 21-year-old chemistry student with ink-stained fingers. That gap between perception and reality became her safety. The Gestapo hunted for male leaders. Anne-Sofie moved freely because no one was looking for her. Her responsibilities grew steadily throughout 1942 and into 19. She coordinated weapons drops from British aircraft, ensuring that containers landed in secure zones and were distributed to the right cells. She managed intelligence networks, collecting information on German troop movements, supply lines, and fortifications, then encoding it for transmission to Allied command. She oversaw sabotage planning, identifying targets, rail lines, communication hubs, fuel depots, and determining which could be struck without triggering massive reprisals. The work demanded perfect timing, absolute discretion, and a willingness to accept that mistakes would cost lives. Anne-Sofie accepted that burden without flinching. She understood that resistance was not heroic in the way people imagined. It was exhausting, incremental, and unforgiving. Every successful operation was followed by another risk, Every quiet victory was shadowed by the knowledge that failure was always one informant away. One operation stands out in the scattered records that survive. In the summer of 1943, Allied intelligence identified a German ammunition train scheduled to pass through southern Norway on its way to reinforcements on the Eastern Front. The train carried artillery shells, small arms, and explosives, enough to supply an entire division. Destroying it would disrupt German logistics for weeks. Anne-Sofie, operating as Aslak, was tasked with coordinating the entire effort. The operation succeeded. The train derailed in a remote valley, its cargo destroyed, its schedule shattered. No resistance fighters were captured. No reprisals followed. Anne-Sofie received the news through a coded message delivered to a cafe near the university. She read it once, memorized it, and burned it in a sink. Then she returned to her chemistry lecture as if nothing had happened. But the success carried a cost that would reveal itself only later. By the autumn of 1943, the Gestapo had intensified its efforts to dismantle Milorg. Informants were everywhere. Arrests were accelerating. Safe houses were being raided. The network that had seemed so resilient a year earlier was beginning to fracture under pressure. Anne-Sofie felt the tension tightening like a wire around her chest. She heard about operatives she had worked with being taken in for interrogation. She learned that certain couriers had disappeared. She noticed that the soldiers at checkpoints were more watchful, more suspicious. The invisibility that had protected her for so long was beginning to feel fragile. Every meeting carried the risk of betrayal. Every coded message could be the last. One of them soon would be. In December 1943, one of Anne-Sofie's closest collaborators, a courier named Henrik, was arrested during a routine checkpoint stop. He was carrying nothing incriminating, but the Gestapo had been tracking him for weeks. Under interrogation, Henrik revealed nothing about Anne-Sofie directly, but he mentioned the name Aslak in connection with a weapons drop. That single reference was enough. The Gestapo began searching for a male commander operating in Oslo. They pulled in suspects. They monitored known resistance, sympathizers. They increased surveillance on university campuses, believing that Aslak might be a student or professor. Anne-Sofie knew the net was closing. She also knew that if she disappeared abruptly, it would raise suspicions and endanger everyone still operating. So she made the decision to continue, as if nothing had changed, even as the risk grew unbearable. The breaking point came in March 9. Anne-Sofie was scheduled to meet with a new courier at a cafe near the National Theatre. The meeting was supposed to be brief, a handoff of instructions, nothing more. But when she arrived, she noticed a man in a dark coat sitting 2 tables away, watching the entrance with studied casualness. She had seen him before, weeks earlier, outside a bookstore where another handoff had taken place. The recognition hit her like cold water. She ordered coffee, sat for exactly 3 minutes, then left without making contact. That night, she burned every document in her apartment, destroyed her coded notebooks, and packed a single bag. She spent the next week moving between safe houses, changing locations every night, waiting for instructions from the Milorg leadership on what to do next. The decision, when it came, was unambiguous. She had to leave Oslo. The risk of capture was too high. If she was taken, the entire Oslo network would unravel. In April 1944, Anne-Sofie fled to Sweden. The escape route took her through the forests along the Norwegian-Swedish border, guided by a network of smugglers and resistance operatives who specialized in moving people out of occupied territory. The journey lasted 5 days. She walked through snow, slept in abandoned cabins, and avoided German patrols by moving only at night. When she finally crossed into Sweden, she was exhausted, frostbitten, and safe. She remained in Sweden for the rest of the war, working with Norwegian exile groups and continuing to relay intelligence where possible. But her operational life as Aslak was over. The codename had served its purpose. The identity that had protected her had also become a cage. In Sweden, she was simply Anne-Sofie again, a refugee, a student, a woman whose war had ended in silence. When Norway was liberated in May 1945, Anne-Sofie returned to Oslo. She completed her chemistry degree and spent decades working in research, never seeking recognition or speaking publicly about Milorg. The post-war narrative centered on male leaders and dramatic sabotage, the kind of visible heroism that fit national mythology. The quiet work of coordination and logistics was harder to celebrate, and in Anne-Sofie's case, it was further obscured by the fact that her contributions had been attributed to a male commander who never existed. In the 1980s, a Norwegian researcher analyzing Milorg documents noticed inconsistencies, references to Aslak that matched no known male operative. The truth emerged. Aslak was Anne-Sofie Østvedt. By then in her 60s, she declined all interviews. She did not want to be turned into a symbol. She wanted only to be left alone. Anne-Sofie Østvedt died in Oslo in 1998, at the age of 77. Her obituary mentioned her career in chemistry and her involvement in the resistance, But it did not dwell on details. There was no state funeral. No monument was erected. No museum exhibit celebrated her contributions. She was buried quietly, and her story remained known only to a handful of historians and former resistance members. The codename Aslak appears in a few scholarly articles and archival footnotes, but it rarely makes it into popular histories of World War II. The reasons for this erasure are familiar: gender bias, the tendency to valorize certain kinds of heroism over others, the difficulty of documenting clandestine work, and the simple fact that Anne-Sofie herself chose silence. But her story endures in the small details: the weapons drops that succeeded because someone had done the math correctly, the intelligence reports that reached Allied command because someone had memorized the radio schedules, the operatives who survived because someone had planned their escape routes with meticulous care. Anne-Sofie Østvedt was not the kind of resistance fighter who appears in films. She did not blow up bridges or assassinate officers. She did not give rousing speeches or lead charges. She coordinated, calculated, and stayed invisible. She let people underestimate her, and she turned that underestimation into armor. She carried a double identity, not as a disguise, but as a necessity, a way of surviving in a world that would not have accepted her authority otherwise. Her war was fought in margins, in silence, in the careful spaces between what people expected and what actually happened, and when it was over, she walked away without asking for recognition, because for her the work had never been about being remembered. It had been about keeping her people alive. How many others like her moved through that same silence, left no monuments, asked for nothing,